The bell at St. Aldrich's had not yet finished ringing the noon hour when the sky over Thornfield Vale opened without warning, and the river that had been a gentle brown ribbon through the valley all spring became something else entirely. A swollen, roaring thing, the color of tea left too long on the stove, dragging branches and fence rails, and the carcass of some poor drowned lamb along with it. Elinor Bramwell had been crossing the footbridge above the mill race with a basket of mending balanced against her hip when she heard the scream. It was not the scream of a woman. It was higher, thinner, cut off too soon, the sound a child makes when the ground goes out from under him, and he has not yet learned that screaming will not bring it back. She turned in time to see a small boy in a blue wool coat pitch forward off the collapsing bank, where the old oak had been undercutting the water all winter, his arms flailing, his mouth open, and then the river simply took him. The way it had taken the lamb, the way it would take anything that did not know how to fight it. There were a dozen people on the road that day, a farmer with his cart, 2 washerwomen, an old man with a walking stick, a boy driving geese to market, and every one of them froze, because that is what people do when the world moves faster than their courage. Elinor did not freeze. She dropped the basket of mending into the mud, hiked her skirts above her knees with both hands, and went down the bank at a dead run before she had even finished deciding to do it. The cold hit her like a fist. She had grown up along this river, had swum in its slow summer pools since she was younger than the boy now vanishing beneath its surface 20 feet ahead of her, and she knew, in the clear animal part of her mind that does not stop to be afraid, that the current here ran fastest in the center, and that if she did not reach him before the bend, the river would carry him under the old stone culvert where the water went black, and no one came out again. She swam. She had never swum so hard in her life, her arms burning, her lungs screaming, the freezing water dragging at her skirts like hands trying to pull her down alongside him. She caught one glimpse of blue wool surfacing near a half-submerged log, and threw herself toward it with everything she had left, and her fingers closed on the collar of his coat, just as the current tried to wrench him past her for good. She did not remember the swim back to the bank. She remembered only the terrible weight of him, limp and unmoving, and the scrape of stone under her knees as she hauled him out onto the mud and turned him onto his side and struck his back with the flat of her hand until he coughed up a lungful of brown water and began, blessedly, furiously, to cry. That was when the horse came down the road at a gallop, and the man who flung himself from its back before the animal had even fully stopped was not dressed like a farmer or a merchant. His coat was fine dark wool, cut close and expensive, even soaked through with rain, and his boots were the kind that cost more than Elinor's family earned in a season, and his face, when he dropped to his knees in the mud beside his son, was not the face of a gentleman remembering his manners. It was the face of a man who had, for one endless moment on the road, believed his whole world had ended. Rowan. His voice broke on the single syllable. He gathered the boy up against his chest, heedless of the mud soaking into his fine coat, his hand shaking as he pressed it to the child's wet hair. "Rowan, I have you. I have you." The boy sobbed into his father's shoulder, and the man closed his eyes, and for a moment he seemed to have forgotten entirely that anyone else was there, that a woman knelt beside him in the mud, with her hair plastered to her face, and her lips gone faintly blue with cold, that it was her hands and her nerve and nothing else that had put his son back into his arms. Then he looked up. Elinor would remember that look for the rest of her life, though she did not yet understand its full weight. It was not gratitude alone, though gratitude was in it. It was something closer to disbelief, as though he were trying to reconcile the ordinary. Mud-streaked young woman kneeling in front of him with the fact that she had done what a dozen grown men on the road had not dared to do. "You went into the river," he said, as if he needed to hear himself say it to believe it. He was going to drown, Elinor said simply, through chattering teeth. It did not occur to her, in that moment, that there was any other answer that made sense. Someone had to go in. No one else did. No, she agreed. No one else did. He stared at her a moment longer, and something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, the way a door left latched too long finally gives beneath a steady hand. Then he seemed to remember himself, and he shrugged out of his own coat, still warm from his body despite the rain, and settled it over her shoulders without asking, the way a man does a thing that does not occur to him to question. "You are freezing," he said. "Both of you. My house is a half-mile up the road. You will come, and you will be warmed, and you will be looked after, and I will hear no argument about it." Elinor opened her mouth to say that she was perfectly capable of walking herself home to her own hearth in the village, that she wanted no fuss made, that gentlemen in fine coats did not generally invite mud-soaked farm girls into their houses. But the boy, Rowan, still shuddering with cold and fright in his father's arms, turned his small tear-streaked face toward her and reached out one hand, and closed his fingers around the sleeve of her sodden dress, as though he meant never to let go of her again. "Don't leave," he whispered. It was not a request a 6-year-old boy makes to a stranger, unless something essential in him has recognized that she is, for this moment at least, the safest thing in the world. Please don't leave. And so Elinor Bramwell, seamstress's daughter, mender of other people's clothes, went up the road to Ashkam Hall, with the water still dripping from the hem of her skirt, not yet knowing that the man whose coat now warmed her shoulders was Alaric Ashworth, 9th Duke of Marrow, and that the boy whose small cold hand had found hers, and refused to release it, was his only son, and the whole of what remained of his family in this world. She learned it from the housekeeper, a broad, brisk woman named Mrs. Feld, who took one look at Elinor's dripping clothes and the state of her hands, raw from the current, and set about the business of warming her with the efficient tenderness of a woman who had clearly done this sort of thing, tending to crises, soothing frightened staff, managing a household through its worst hours, many times before. "His Grace doesn't often come down that road himself," Mrs. Feld said, wrapping a blanket around Elinor's shoulders in the little sitting room off the kitchen, while a fire was coaxed into roaring life. "Not since her ladyship passed. He keeps to the estate mostly, buries himself in the account books, and the tenant matters, leaves young Master Rowan to his nurse." But he had taken the boy out riding today, first time in months, and the nurse had gone ahead with the pony while his Grace saw to a fallen fence. And, well, you know the rest better than any of us. "His Grace," Elinor repeated slowly, feeling the words settle strangely in her chest, like stones dropped into still water. That was the Duke. The Duke of Marrow himself. "Yes, love, and that boy you pulled out of the water is his heir." Mrs. Feld's eyes, not unkind, studied her with new and careful interest. "You didn't know." "I did not know," Elinor said. "I only saw a child falling." Something in the housekeeper's face softened further at that, as though the answer had told her more about the young woman in front of her than any polished speech could have. "Well," she said, "you'll want dry clothes, and something hot inside you, and then His Grace will want to speak with you himself. Once he's satisfied himself the boy's not taken a chill. Don't be frightened of him. He's not a hard man, whatever the county gossips say. He's only a tired one." Elinor did not know what to make of that, but she had little time to consider it, because within the hour a maid came to say that His Grace requested her presence in the small parlour, if she was recovered enough to receive him, and Elinor found herself smoothing the skirts of a borrowed grey dress, plain, but finer than anything she owned, and walking down an unfamiliar corridor lined with portraits of Ashworth ancestors, who all seemed to regard her with the same faint, aristocratic surprise. The Duke was standing by the window when she entered, his son asleep at last on a settee nearby, wrapped in blankets with a spot of colour returned to his cheeks. He turned as she came in, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He had changed out of his ruined coat into another equally fine, and cleaned. He looked exactly what he was, a man of considerable rank, tall and composed, with the kind of quiet authority that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. And yet there was something in his face, some tautness around the eyes, that told Elinor Mrs. Feld had spoken true. Whatever his title, he had spent the last hour as any father spends the hour after nearly losing his child, hollowed out and grateful past the point of proper words. "Miss Bramwell," he said. Someone had told him her name then. "I find myself in the singular position of owing a debt I do not know how to begin repaying. You owe me nothing, Your Grace." She dipped the small, awkward curtsy she had seen other women give to gentry, uncertain if she was doing it correctly, uncertain of anything in this room full of firelight and unfamiliar furniture. "I did only what anyone would do. That is precisely what troubles me," he said, and there was an edge of something raw beneath the words. "A dozen people stood on that road and did nothing. You alone went into that water without a moment's hesitation, without knowing who my son was, without any promise of thanks or reward, at real risk to your own life. Do not tell me that is what anyone would do, Miss Bramwell. I have lived among a great many people who would not have done it." Elinor did not know how to answer that, so she said the only honest thing she had. "I could not have lived with myself if I had stood on that bank and watched him go under. That is not courage, Your Grace. That is only knowing what I would not be able to forgive in myself afterward." Something moved behind his eyes at that. Not quite a smile, but its quiet ancestor. "That," he said softly, "is very nearly a definition of courage that I have never heard bettered." He was quiet a moment, watching the fire, and when he spoke again his voice had gentled further, taken on the careful shape of a man working out loud what he had already half decided. "My son will not stop asking for you. Even asleep, not a quarter hour ago he woke calling your name, though I confess he does not yet have it quite right. He calls you the River Lady, and would not settle again until Mrs. Feld assured him you were still beneath this roof. He has not been an easy child since his mother died, Miss Bramwell. He does not trust easily, and yet in the space of one terrible afternoon he has attached himself to you, as though you were kin. Children are frightened creatures sometimes, Your Grace. It will pass, once the fright of today does." Perhaps he turned to look at her fully then, and there was something searching in his gaze, some calculation she could not read. Or perhaps he has simply recognized, the way children sometimes do before the rest of us catch up, that you are someone worth trusting. "I would like to ask something of you, Miss Bramwell, and I ask it plainly, because I think you are the sort of woman who prefers plain speaking to flattery. Rowan's nurse is a competent woman, but she is not. She does not have whatever it is you carry with you. That steadiness, that instinct to act rather than freeze. I would like you to come to Ashkam Hall, for a time, to help settle him, as a companion to him, in whatever capacity you are willing. I will pay you well, and fairly, and you may leave the moment you wish to." Elinor's first instinct was refusal. She was a seamstress's daughter, not a governess. She had no training in the raising of a duke's heir, and every fibre of her practical village upbringing told her that a woman who took up residence in a nobleman's house on the strength of one dramatic afternoon was inviting exactly the kind of gossip that ruined reputations and closed doors. But then she thought of the boy's small, cold hand closing around her sleeve, of his voice cracking on the word please, and something in her, the same something that had sent her down the riverbank without a second's hesitation, would not let her say no. "I have a mother at home who depends on my sewing for part of our living," she said carefully. "I could not simply vanish from the village. Then you will not vanish. You will come and go as suits you, and whatever wages you would have earned from your needlework, I will more than match, so that your mother wants for nothing in your absence. I am not asking you to abandon your life, Miss Bramwell. I am asking you to lend a portion of it to a boy who has had very little steadiness in his own." She looked past him, to the sleeping child on the settee, his small chest rising and falling evenly now, one hand still curled loosely as though even in sleep he was reaching for something to hold. And she thought of her own father, gone 5 years now, and how she remembered most clearly not his voice or his face, but the steadiness of his hand on her shoulder during a thunderstorm when she was very young, and how that steadiness had taught her, more than any lecture ever could, that the world was survivable. "I will come," she said, "for his sake, not for any reward." "I did not imagine for a moment that it was for reward," the Duke said, and this time the almost smile reached all the way to completion, brief and unguarded, transforming his face into something younger and less burdened than the man who had galloped down the road an hour before. "Thank you, Miss Bramwell. I do not say that easily, or often, but I mean it with the whole of what remains of my family. That was how it began, not with a ballroom or a chance meeting over cards, but with cold river water and a child's terrified scream, and a debt too large for ordinary gratitude." And Elinor Bramwell walked back to the village that evening wrapped in a borrowed shawl, her own dress dried and returned to her, carrying with her a promise she did not yet fully understand the shape of. The first week at Ashkam Hall taught Elinor more about the strange, cushioned loneliness of a great house than any story she had ever heard whispered in the village. There was a hush to the place that unsettled her at first. Corridors so long that footsteps seemed to vanish before reaching the far end. Rooms furnished for gatherings that no longer happened. A formal dining hall that could seat 40 and stood empty most evenings, save for one man eating alone at its head, attended by servants trained to move so quietly they were almost invisible. She had imagined, in her ignorance, that wealth meant warmth, that a house so grand must surely be a happy one. She learned quickly that grandeur and warmth were not the same thing at all, and that this particular house had been missing its warmth for the better part of 2 years. Rowan felt that missing warmth most keenly, though he lacked the words to name it. He did not misbehave exactly. He was, if anything, too well behaved for a boy his age, too careful, too watchful of the adults around him, as though he had learned early that his own wants mattered less than the smooth running of a household in mourning. Elinor noticed this within her first few days in the nursery, the way he asked permission for things a child ought simply to do. "May I laugh loudly? May I run in the corridor? May I ask Papa to read to me tonight?" as though joy itself required a formal request, and might reasonably be denied. She began, quietly and without announcing her intentions to anyone, to dismantle that carefulness in him, piece by piece. She let him shout when a game called for shouting. She insisted, gently but firmly, that laughter needed no one's permission in this nursery, not while she had charge of it. She taught him to skip stones on the ornamental lake, an activity Mrs. Feld considered faintly undignified for a future duke, and permitted anyway, because she had watched the boy's face when he sent his first stone bouncing 3 times across the water, and had not had the heart to deny him a second attempt. It was on one such afternoon, weeks into her new arrangement, that Alaric came upon them by the lake, without either of them noticing his approach, and stood for some minutes at the edge of the willows, simply watching, his son shrieking with delight at a particularly successful throw, Elinor laughing along with him, her hair coming loose from its pins in the breeze, entirely unguarded in a way she never was in his presence, because she had not yet learned to be guarded around him at all. He told her, much later, that it was in that unwitnessed moment, rather than any of their conversations since, that he had first understood the shape of what he was beginning to feel. Not gratitude, not admiration alone, but something quieter and more permanent, the recognition of a person he wanted simply to watch living, without needing anything more from the moment than that. He did not say so then. He returned to the house without announcing his presence, and it was another fortnight before Elinor learned, from Mrs. Feld of all people, that His Grace had stood by the lake that afternoon and watched them both for the better part of a quarter-hour before anyone noticed him there. Her mother, when she heard the story, went very pale and then very quiet, the particular quiet of a woman who has spent her whole life watching the gap between gentry and village folk and knows exactly how such arrangements are whispered about long before they are ever explained. "You will be careful," she said finally, taking Elinor's raw, river-scraped hands in her own. "A duke's household is not like ours, love. There will be eyes on you. Not all of them kind." "I know, Mother. Do you?" Her mother searched her face. "You went in after that child without a thought for yourself. That is a fine and a rare thing, and I am prouder of you than I can say. But going into that house, that is a different river, Elinor, and this one does not show you where the current runs." Elinor thought of that warning many times in the weeks that followed, as she settled into a strange new rhythm. Mornings spent at Ashkam Hall in the nursery wing with Rowan, afternoons walking the estate grounds with him gathering chestnuts, or watching the swans on the ornamental lake, evenings returning to the village to sit with her mother over the mending basket as though her days had not just been spent in rooms hung with silk and portraits of a lineage older than the church itself. Rowan bloomed under her attention in a way that surprised even Mrs. Feld, who had watched over the boy since his mother's death 2 years past, and had begun, quietly, to fear that some essential brightness in him had gone out for good. He laughed more. He asked fewer of the anxious, repetitive questions he had once asked his nurse a dozen times a day. "Is Papa coming back? Will you leave? Is the storm going to flood the nursery?" As though Elinor's steady presence had answered some of those fears simply by existing. And the Duke, Alaric, though she did not dare think his given name for a long while, as though the familiarity of it might summon some consequence she was not prepared for, watched all of this from a careful distance at first. The distance of a busy man with an estate to run, and tenants to see to and correspondence that arrived daily from London demanding his attention. But distance has a way of closing itself, when two people share a table at supper, more evenings than not. When a father lingers in the nursery doorway to watch his son laughing at some game. When a woman looks up from a storybook to find him already watching her rather than the boy. It was a small thing. At first, an exchange over a book Rowan had asked her to read for the 3rd time in a week. A discussion of whether the fox in the story deserved to be caught. The Duke, passing the nursery door, had paused to listen, and then, unable to help himself, had stepped inside to argue the fox's case with an earnestness that made Rowan shriek with delighted laughter at seeing his father debate literature with such solemn conviction. "You are entirely too soft on foxes, Your Grace," Elinor told him afterward. Once Rowan had been put to bed and they stood together in the corridor outside the nursery, the candlelight throwing long shadows against the old stone walls. "I begin to suspect you have a fondness for creatures who take what does not belong to them." "I have a fondness for creatures who are clever enough to survive on their wits alone," he said. "It is not the same thing as approving of theft. Though I confess I have some sympathy for a fox with hungry kits at home. That is precisely the kind of reasoning that gets foxes into henhouses, Your Grace." Perhaps his eyes held hers a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a conversation about a children's story, though I find I have grown rather tired of reasoning that keeps everyone safely on their own side of the fence. Miss Bramwell. It makes for a very lonely sort of correctness. She did not know how to answer that, and something in his own expression suggested he had surprised himself by saying it. He inclined his head, wished her good evening, and retreated down the corridor with the particular stiffness of a man who has said more than he intended and is now busy pretending otherwise. Elinor walked home that night with her thoughts in a tangle she could not fully unpick. She told herself, firmly, that a duke's passing fondness for a conversation about foxes did not mean anything beyond a lonely man's gratitude for company that did not defer to him out of fear. She told herself this several more times over the following weeks, with steadily decreasing conviction. As the small exchanges multiplied, a walk in the orchard that neither of them quite planned, a shared laugh over Rowan's insistence that the estate's oldest and most bad-tempered goose was secretly a transformed knight, an evening when a summer storm kept her from walking home, and the Duke himself insisted on driving her back in his own carriage, rather than sending a groom, and sat beside her in the swaying dark, saying very little, and yet somehow saying, in the silence, more than either of them was prepared to name aloud. There were quieter days too, in between the ones that later seemed to mark the story's turning points, and it was in those quieter days that the true weight of the household settled onto Elinor's shoulders, and she began to understand what it might mean to belong, even in some unofficial capacity, to a world so different from the one she had known. She learned the names of the tenant families who came to the kitchen door with baskets of produce and requests for the Duke's ear on matters of drainage and rent. She learned which of the upstairs maids was walking out with a groom from the neighboring estate, and kept the secret when the girl asked her to, understanding better than most the particular fear of a love that crossed lines other people had drawn, without being asked. She learned, too, the private grief still folded into the corners of the house, a locked room on the second floor that had been the late Duchess's, which no one entered and no one spoke of, and which Elinor passed each morning on her way to the nursery, with a careful, respectful silence of her own. It was Rowan, in the end, who first mentioned his mother to her directly, on a grey afternoon when the rain kept them indoors, and he had grown restless with his lessons and wandered, instead, into a quieter kind of remembering. "Papa doesn't talk about her," he said without preamble, looking up from the wooden horse he had been walking along the windowsill. "The lady in the portrait in the hall. That's my mother, Mrs. Feld told me, but Papa's never said her name to me. Not once that I can remember." Elinor set down her needlework carefully, giving the boy her full attention, sensing that this was not a moment to be hurried past. "Sometimes," she said, "when a loss is very great, it is hardest to speak of it to the very people we love most, for fear of causing them pain too. I do not think it means he does not think of her. I think it may mean he thinks of her so often that he has not yet found words small enough to say without breaking." Rowan considered this with the peculiar gravity children bring to questions adults have long since learned to avoid. "Do you think she would have liked you?" The question caught Elinor entirely unprepared, and she felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. "I could not say, dearest. I never had the honor of knowing her. But I think, from everything I have heard of her kindness and her care for you, that she and I would have agreed on the most important thing there is to agree upon." "What's that?" "That you deserve to be loved a great deal, and looked after very carefully, and never ever left alone in the dark." She reached out and smoothed his hair back from his forehead, the gesture as natural to her now as breathing. "That is the only thing that truly matters, in the end. Everything else, a family can work out together." She did not tell Alaric of that conversation for several days, uncertain whether it was hers to share. But when at last she did, one evening as they sat together in the small parlour, with the fire burning low, he was quiet for a long while, staring into the flames with an expression she could not entirely read. "I have been a coward about her," he admitted finally. "Margaret, my wife. I could not bear, after she died, to see her name in Rowan's mouth and feel the whole weight of losing her all over again, and so I said nothing, and let him grow up believing, I think, that grief was a country too dangerous even to visit in conversation. That was not fair to him, nor, I think, to her memory." "It is not too late to change that," Elinor said gently. Grief does not close its doors forever, Alaric. It only asks to be visited with care. He reached for her hand then, turning it over in his own, tracing the small scar along her palm where a fragment of river debris had cut her the day of the rescue, a mark she had almost forgotten she carried. "You have a way of saying difficult things so plainly that they stop being frightening," he said. "I do not know how you manage it." "Practice," she said, with the ghost of a smile. "I have spent my whole life saying plain things to people who would rather I dressed them up prettier. It has made me rather stubborn about it." "I am glad of your stubbornness," he said, and lifted her scarred hand to his lips. "I think it may be the finest quality I have ever encountered in another human being." That evening marked something of a turning point, though neither of them named it as such at the time. Alaric began, slowly, to speak of Margaret, small things at first, the way she had loved the roses along the south wall, the particular laugh she had when Rowan, as an infant, had done something especially ridiculous, the fierce, protective love she had carried for a boy she had only 3 short years to raise before illness took her. Rowan listened to these stories with a hunger that told Elinor, more clearly than anything else could have, how starved he had been for them, and how much healthier, in the weeks that followed, his sleep became, his temper eased, his small face less often shadowed by fears he could not name, because no one had ever given him words for what he had lost. It could not, of course, remain unnoticed. A household is a small and watchful world, and Ashkam Hall's servants were neither blind nor slow to gossip, however loyal. Word travelled, as it always does, first through the kitchens, then through the village, gathering embellishment as it went, until by late summer Elinor could feel the change in how people looked at her when she walked to market. The narrowed eyes of the older women, the whispers behind raised hands, the particular chill from Mrs. Colworth, whose daughter Prudence had long been spoken of, at least by Mrs. Colworth herself, as a fitting match for a duke, being both well-born on her mother's side and possessed of a fortune sufficient to please any family's solicitor. It came to a head one afternoon in late August, when Elinor arrived at the hall to find Mrs. Colworth herself taking tea in the drawing-room, with Prudence at her side, both women dressed in the kind of understated finery that costs a great deal precisely because it pretends not to, and the Duke seated across from them with the careful, courteous blankness of a man enduring a social obligation he had not sought. Mrs. Colworth's gaze travelled over Elinor from the doorway with the slow, assessing thoroughness of a woman valuing livestock. "Ah," she said, "this must be the young person who has been so helpful with young Lord Rowan. How very good of his Grace to take such an interest in the village's welfare." The condescension in the words was not subtle, and Elinor felt her face heat, though she kept her chin level and her voice steady. "I am glad to be of use to the family, madam, of use." Mrs. Colworth's smile did not reach her eyes. "Yes, I imagine you are. Though I confess I wonder whether a household such as this might do better to secure more permanent arrangements for the boy's welfare. A proper governess, perhaps, someone of appropriate background and education, rather than a village girl, however well-meaning, who happened to be in the right place at the right moment." Mrs. Colworth, the Duke's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the courtesy, a warning any who knew him well would have recognized instantly. Miss Bramwell did a great deal more than happen to be in the right place. She went into a flooding river after my son, when a dozen grown men on that road stood and watched. I do not believe there is a governess in England, however proper her education, who could have done what she did that day, and I will not sit in my own home and hear her described as though her courage were some accident of geography. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Mrs. Colworth's smile thinned to something brittle, and Prudence, at least, had the grace to look faintly embarrassed on her mother's behalf, though she said nothing. The visit concluded shortly after, with the stiff, chilled formality of guests who have overstayed both their welcome and their tact, and once the carriage had rattled away down the drive, the Duke turned to Elinor with an apology already forming on his face. "I am sorry you had to hear that. You need not apologize for another's rudeness, Your Grace." "Alaric," he said suddenly, and then seemed almost surprised at himself for saying it. "I would, if you are willing, I would have you call me Alaric, at least when we are not in company that would find it scandalous. I find myself tired of Your Grace from the one person in this house whose opinion of me matters most." Elinor's heart was beating very fast, and she was grateful for the excuse of tidying a stack of Rowan's picture books so that she did not have to meet his eyes directly while she found her voice. "That would not be wise, Your Grace. You heard Mrs. Colworth. There are already those who whisper. Let them whisper." There was an unfamiliar heat in his voice now, the heat of a careful man finally allowing himself to speak without calculation. "Elinor, I have spent 2 years since my wife died governing this estate and raising my son, and behaving, in every particular, exactly as a duke is expected to behave, with propriety, with restraint, with the correct degree of grief observed for the correct number of months." And then a quiet, sensible return to the business of managing an inheritance that was never truly mine to want in the first place. "I did not ask to want anything again." And then a woman in a mended dress went into a flooding river without a moment's hesitation, and asked for nothing in return, and taught my son to laugh again, and I find that I cannot govern my own heart with the same discipline I have governed everything else. Elinor's hands had gone still on the picture books. "Your Grace Alaric," he corrected, gently, and stepped closer. Close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze. "I am not asking you to answer today. I know what I am asking, and I know the difficulty of it, the difference in our stations, the talk it will cause, the fact that you have every reason to distrust a man of my rank offering you feelings, rather than an insult dressed as flattery. I only wished you to know the truth of it, plainly, the way you have always spoken plainly to me. I have come to love you, Elinor Bramwell, not for the rescue, though I will be grateful for that till my dying day, but for everything since, your steadiness, your honesty, the way my son's whole world brightened the day you walked into it, the way mine has too, though I was slower and more foolish about admitting it." For a long moment, Elinor could not speak at all. She thought of her mother's warning, "This is a different river, and it does not show you where the current runs," and understood now fully what her mother had meant, because she felt herself being carried by something far stronger than she could control, and she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to fight it. "I do not know how to be a duchess," she said finally, the words coming out smaller and more frightened than she intended. "I know how to mend a hem and manage a household budget for 3 people, not for an estate with 200 tenants and a name older than the church. I am afraid, Alaric, of failing you in ways I cannot even foresee yet." "Then we will foresee them together," he said. "I did not fall in love with a duchess, Elinor. I fell in love with a woman who dove into a river without stopping to calculate the cost. I would not ask that woman to become someone smaller and more cautious, merely to fit a title. I would rather learn, alongside you, how a title might grow large enough to fit her instead. It was not in the end a swift or simple courtship, whatever the heat of that afternoon's confession might have suggested. There were weeks still of careful distance in public and cautious, growing warmth in private, of Elinor's own fears working themselves slowly loose, of the Duke's household gradually, grudgingly, coming to see what young Rowan had understood from the very first terrified moment on the riverbank, that here was a woman whose worth had nothing to do with the accident of her birth, and everything to do with the constancy of her character. Mrs. Colworth did not relent easily, and for a time the whispers in the village grew louder rather than quieter, fed by her wounded pride and Prudence's disappointed hopes. There were cold looks at market, A pointed exclusion from the harvest social that stung more than Elinor liked to admit. A rumor, never quite traced to its source, though everyone suspected, that suggested Elinor had engineered the entire rescue for exactly this purpose, had somehow known the boy would fall, had calculated her way into a duke's favor with the cold precision of a fortune hunter. That rumor reached Alaric before it reached Elinor, and it was perhaps the closest thing to open fury she ever saw in him. Not loud, for he was not a loud man, but a controlled, precise anger that sent him striding into the village the following market day and standing, quite deliberately, in the center of the square where the gossips gathered, to address the matter directly rather than let it fester in whispers. "I understand," he said, his voice carrying easily across the square, pitched for exactly the audience he intended, "that there is some question as to the character of Miss Elinor Bramwell, and the circumstances of her acquaintance with my household. I would settle the matter plainly, so that no one need wonder or whisper further. I was on that road myself, the day my son fell into the flooded river. I saw a dozen people, farmers, tradesmen, respectable folk all, freeze where they stood. I saw one woman who owed my family nothing and had every reason to fear the cold water as much as anyone, throw down her basket and go in after him without a single moment's hesitation, at real risk to her own life, expecting no reward and asking for none. If there is a soul in this village who believes such a woman capable of the cold calculation being whispered about her, I invite them to say so to my face, here, now, rather than to my back in corners. I will not have her character diminished by those who lack the courage she showed that day, and who resent, perhaps, being reminded of it. No one, of course, took up that particular invitation, and the whispers, if they did not vanish entirely, at least learned to keep themselves quieter after that. It was, Elinor thought when she heard the story from Mrs. Feld, for she had not been present herself, having been at the hall with Rowan that morning, a strange and moving thing, to be defended so plainly and so publicly by a man who might so easily have let the gossip fade on its own and spared himself the awkwardness of the confrontation. The final test came, as such stories often demand, when it was least expected and most feared. It was early autumn, the harvest nearly in, when a fire broke out in the old east wing of Ashkam Hall in the small hours of the night, a fallen candle in the disused library. The household would later determine, catching among old papers and spreading with terrible speed through rooms no one had thought to check, because no one had thought there was reason to. Elinor had stayed late that evening, delayed by a storm that made the walk home unwise, and was asleep in the small guest chamber near the nursery wing when the smell of smoke woke her. She did not think. She never did. In the moments that mattered, that was perhaps the truest thing anyone would ever say of her character. She was in the nursery before she had fully finished waking, gathering Rowan from his bed, as the corridor beyond filled with smoke thick enough to sting her eyes and burn her throat, and she was halfway down the servant's stair with the boy clutched against her chest, coughing, disoriented, feeling her way along the wall in darkness gone suddenly, terribly opaque, when a section of ceiling gave way behind her with a roar of falling timber and sparks, so close that the heat of it singed the ends of her hair. She did not remember, afterward, exactly how she found the door. She remembered only stumbling out into the cold night air, with Rowan still held tight against her, both of them coughing, both of them alive, and the chaos of the household spilling out around them, servants with buckets, grooms leading panicked horses from the stables lest the fire spread, and the Duke, who had been in the west wing when the alarm was raised, and had run the length of the house calling his son's name with a terror in his voice that Elinor would remember for the rest of her days, because she had never before heard a man of such careful composure sound so entirely undone. He found them at the edge of the garden, and the sound he made, somewhere between a sob and her name, spoken like a prayer, was not something a duke was meant to make in front of his household, and he did not seem to care in the slightest. He gathered them both into his arms, his son and the woman who had saved his son twice now, and for a long moment none of them spoke at all, only breathed, together in the cold, clean air, grateful beyond words, simply to be alive to breathe it. "You went back into a burning house," he said finally, into her singed hair, his voice raw. "For him." "Again, I could not leave him," Elinor said simply, the same simplicity with which she had answered him after the river, because it was, in the end, still the truest thing she knew about herself. "I will never be able to leave him. Or you." "Then don't," Alaric said, and drew back just far enough to look at her properly, soot-streaked and trembling and utterly unwilling to let go of the boy in her arms. And something in his face was so open, so entirely, without the careful reserve he wore for the rest of the world, that she felt the last of her own doubts finally, fully dissolve. "Marry me, Elinor, not because you saved my son's life twice over. Though God knows I will be grateful for that, until I draw my last breath. Marry me, because I cannot imagine a single day of the rest of my life that I would rather spend without you in it. Marry me, because Rowan has already chosen you as his mother in every way that matters, and because the whole of Ashkam Hall, staff and tenants, and even, I suspect, Mrs. Colworth in her heart of hearts, already knows what I am only now finding the courage to say aloud in front of them all." The gathered servants, still clutching their buckets, still smudged with smoke and effort, had gone entirely silent, watching, and Elinor was distantly aware that this was perhaps the least private proposal ever offered by a duke to anyone, and found, in the end, that she did not mind in the slightest. "Yes," she said, and the word came out rough with smoke and full of a happiness too large for careful phrasing. "Yes, Alaric, I will marry you." The cheer that went up from the assembled household was not, perhaps, entirely proper for the occasion, given the smouldering ruin of the east wing behind them, but no one seemed inclined to mind, least of all the Duke, who kissed her then, in front of God and his tenants and his weeping, laughing son, with a tenderness that answered every fear she had carried since that first terrifying, transformative afternoon on the riverbank. In the days that followed, while the east wing still smoked faintly in the cold morning air, and workmen from the village came to assess the damage and begin the long labor of rebuilding, Elinor found herself unable to stop shaking whenever she thought too long of that corridor filling with smoke, of the ceiling giving way behind her, of how narrowly the story might have ended in grief instead of gratitude. Alaric found her one evening sitting alone in the walled garden, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing, and he sat beside her without a word for a long while before finally speaking. "You are allowed to be frightened now," he said quietly. "You did not allow yourself to be frightened in the moment, because there was no room for it, because Rowan needed you steady. But it is over now, and you may set the fear down if you wish, rather than carry it alone." "I keep seeing it," she admitted, her voice unsteady in a way she rarely permitted it to be. "The ceiling. How close it came. I think I did not fully understand until now how much I have to lose, now that I have finally allowed myself to want something for my own sake. Nor did I," he said, "until I stood in that garden and did not know, for the length of several unbearable minutes, whether either of you was still alive to be found. I have buried a wife, Elinor. I have stood beside a grave and believed, for a time, that I had used up whatever fortune I was owed in this life. I did not think I would be asked to stand at the edge of losing everything a second time. I do not know that I could survive it again." She turned to look at him then, and found his own eyes bright with unshed tears, this careful, composed man who governed an estate and 200 tenants with quiet authority, undone entirely by the thought of a future without her in it. She reached for his hand, and he held hers tightly, and they sat together in the cooling evening air, until the shaking in her had settled, until the fear had found, if not its end, then at least a place to rest. News of the engagement travelled through the county with the particular speed reserved for scandal and romance alike. And not everyone received it with grace. Letters arrived from distant cousins of the Ashworth line, some warmly curious, others coolly disapproving, questioning the wisdom of a duke marrying so far beneath his station, suggesting, in the careful language of people who wished to seem concerned rather than cruel, that Elinor's courage, however real, was no substitute for breeding, and that a marriage built on gratitude rather than equal rank might prove in time an uneasy foundation for a great house to stand upon. Alaric answered each letter himself, in his own hand, with a patience Elinor found remarkable, given how plainly the insinuations wounded him on her behalf. They mistake gratitude for the whole of it, he told her one evening, setting aside yet another such letter with a weary sigh. They have not seen you argue with me over a children's story until I conceded the fox deserved better treatment. They have not seen you sit up 3 nights running with a feverish child, who was not your own by any law of blood, simply because you could not bear the thought of him frightened and alone. Gratitude I owe you in full measure, Elinor, but it is not gratitude that makes me want to spend the whole of my remaining life in your company. That is something else entirely, and no letter from a cousin twice removed will convince me otherwise. It was Mrs. Feld, in the end, who did more to settle the matter among the wider household and the surrounding tenantry than any letter or public defence could have managed, for she took it upon herself, in her own quiet way, to remind anyone who would listen of precisely what kind of woman had been chosen, and precisely what she had already given the household long before any ring was offered. I have served this family the better part of 30 years, she was heard to say to a sceptical visiting housekeeper from a neighbouring estate, and I tell you plainly, I have never seen a woman walk into grief and fear the way Miss Bramwell did. Not once, not twice, but again and again, without a single thought for herself. If that is not the making of a duchess, then I do not know what breeding is meant to teach a person that plain courage does not teach better. Slowly, through the autumn and into the first hard frosts of winter, the county's opinion softened, or at least grew quieter in its objections, worn down by the plain evidence of the household's happiness, and by Rowan himself, who had taken to informing anyone who would listen, with the guileless conviction of a child utterly certain of his own rightness, that Miss Bramwell was the finest person in all of England, and that anyone who said differently simply had not yet had the good fortune to know her properly. They were married the following spring, in the small chapel on the estate grounds, rather than the grand cathedral in the county town that convention might have demanded, because Elinor had asked, quietly, whether they might be married somewhere that felt like theirs, rather than somewhere that felt like a performance for the county, and Alaric had agreed without a moment's hesitation, understanding by then precisely the kind of woman he had chosen, and precisely why an ordinary chapel suited her better than any grand cathedral ever could. Rowan stood beside them at the altar, insisting with all the solemn dignity a 7-year-old could muster that it was his particular duty to hold the ring, since it was, after all, entirely his fault, or his good fortune, depending how one chose to tell the story, that his father and his river lady had ever met at all. The village came, even those who had once whispered, for gratitude and forgiveness have a way of settling into a place over time, the way silt settles at the bottom of a river once the flood has finally passed. Mrs. Colworth attended too, stiffly at first and then, by the end of the wedding breakfast, with something almost like genuine warmth, for even the most reluctant hearts are not entirely immune to witnessing real happiness, plainly and unguardedly displayed. And every year afterward, on the anniversary of that terrible, wonderful afternoon, when a boy fell into a raging river, and a woman went in after him without a single thought for who he might belong to, the family walked together down to the old footbridge above the mill race, now rebuilt and sturdy, and stood a while by the water that had once nearly taken everything from them, and had instead, in its strange and terrible mercy, given them each other. Rowan grew tall and steady, with his father's quiet composure and his stepmother's fearless heart, and told the story of his rescue so many times over the years, to so many wide-eyed cousins, and eventually his own children, that it became something closer to legend than memory. The day the river tried to take him, and a woman who did not yet know his name loved him enough, and bravely enough, to refuse to let it.